Hi, I'm Randy Beardsley and welcome to the Beardsley Doctrine. Our country, America, was built on the principles of independence and liberty. And these principles were protected by our government, just like our God-given rights were. But through the years, we've strayed a long way from these founding principles that made our country great. Today, as promised, I'll discuss in more detail the American Death March. This march, the one that you're on now, whether you know it or not, is destined to destroy your future if it hasn't already, and has us well on our way to destroying America also. If you think I'm wrong, or you think you already know the full story, I won't be so confident until you hear me out. Now the good thing is, a lot of people know something's wrong. Many people I've run into throughout our country share common questions. Where did America go wrong? How did we go from a world powerhouse to the fringes of a third world country in a mere 50, 60 year time frame? These are great questions, because without knowing the answer to these questions, without knowing how we got here, it's going to be hard to figure out the right way to go. So I'm going to answer those questions today. I'm absolutely going to show you that the path that we're on now is the wrong way. But I'm also going to show you that the process of this decline, it started a lot earlier than 1960. Like a lot of other information that we've looked at, the results are shocking. Oftentimes, the level of incompetence in our country, or the betrayal against our country, is so great that it's difficult to believe that it could be true, but it is. So any doubts, I always provide a reference to the source material, so you can go check the information yourself. There's a lot that's gone on in our country since 1776, and it requires a lot of detail in this session to properly represent it all. So I strongly suggest that you watch these sessions on a bigger screen, such as your computer, or even better on a TV, to make sure you don't miss anything. I'll try to go quickly, but don't hesitate to pause on a particular graph or slide to make sure you fully understand this tragedy that's unfolding in front of us. You may think you know something about the history of our country, but you only know the history and the things that they want you to know, not what you need to know. Today I'm going to begin to tell you about the things that you need to know. So let's go ahead and get started. The history of our country and the steps of this death march are divided into 5 distinct phases that start in 1776. In each phase after the first, there's a gradual loss of freedom, rights, and opportunity. You may not even notice it, but it's happening. Phase 1, which I call Let Freedom Ring, lasts from 1776 till 1913. Now you may ask, why does this phase 1 end in 1913? What was important about that year? It ends in 1913 because that's when the federal government enacts the personal income tax. Now, a lot of people don't know this because all they've ever known is the income tax. But other than a few years to finance more Americans killing each other during the Civil War, Americans never paid an income tax for the first 137 years of our country's existence. Actually, in 1895, the Supreme Court even ruled a previous federal government attempt to tax our hard-earned money as unconstitutional. Americans kept the money they earned for their own family. They didn't give any of it to the federal government other than some sales tax. Not paying any taxes and keeping the money that you worked for your family, that didn't used to be the novel concept that it is today. So let's talk about America in phase 1 and examine the status of the 5 main groups in our country during a time when America prospered. Here's what America looked like in the beginning and for a lot of years after. Now, the first group in our march are regular Americans. These are free, independent Americans that worked hard and provided for themselves. I highlighted them in green down there on the right. These are people like you and me. They made their own decisions, provided for themselves either because opportunity existed in our country or because they created their own opportunity. And their fate, it was determined by their own actions. A couple things I want you to take notice of. See how much money regular Americans possess due to their hard work. They kept the money that they worked for. Take a look at this. It shows graphically that Americans never paid income tax during phase one from 1776 until 1913, other than a few years during the Civil War. See that tiny amount? And our country and government managed fine. Hard to believe, but true. Now, one of the other things I want you to know is how many Americans fit into this group. The great majority of Americans were free and independent. Americans without government intervention, creating a future for their families and for our country. Now, the next group I want to discuss is the American government and their friends. Their friends include banks, media companies, the military complex, that sort. The federal government had limited powers per our Constitution and limited money and wealth. Look how little money the government and their friends had and controlled in the blue box. The people had a lot more than them during phase one. Our third player is big business. They're up there on the left. There were still a lot of small companies, but large companies began to emerge. They were profitable. They began to amass large sums of money. Take a look at the blue box. They had more money than the government. And although we didn't have a corporate income tax back then, business did contribute to the government with licensing and fees. You can see the green arrow with the single dollar sign in it going from business to the government to help fund it. But it wasn't a lot of money. Here's the amount of corporate income tax that funded the government during phase one. So it's the same as the people's income tax. Other than funding a war for a few years, business didn't pay any income tax. So at this point, you should be asking yourself, if the people barely supported the government and business barely supported the government, how was the government funded? Well, before I answer that, I want to make the point that when the federal government is performing the responsibilities granted to it in the Constitution, it doesn't require a lot of funding because it doesn't really have a lot of rights and authorities. The states do. So during this period where the federal government actually followed the Constitution, the government was funded primarily through tariffs, customs, and duties on imported goods, with some assistance, as mentioned already, from some excise or sales tax on tobacco, alcohol, and such. Take a look at this graph. For over the first 100 years of our country, tariffs on imported goods financed over 80% of the government's expenses, not the people or business, and after the Civil War dropped only because the government began to increase excise taxes and began to shift the burden onto regular Americans. The men who ran our government at the time, they understood that protecting our own country's industries and securing jobs for our own citizens had to be a priority. This clearly isn't one of our government priorities of today. So during phase one, big business is paying a little of the tax burden. The next group in America were poor Americans in need. This group included poor people, recently freed slaves, and immigrants new to the country. This group possessed little wealth, as shown in the blue box. And with help from friends, family, good-hearted people, and churches, they got by. Americans in this group, they worked hard. And when they did, they were able to join the middle class because opportunity existed for people who worked hard. It wasn't suffocated by government regulations, taxes, and control. Finally, the last group we'll look at are immigrants. They're down there on the left. They came to America. Most had little money. But they didn't come here to get something for free because there wasn't anything here for free. They came here primarily from Europe, but some from all over the world to be part of our great country. Let's see highlighted in blue arrows showing immigrants coming into our country. And although most started as poor Americans in need, they had the desire to work hard, learn our language and customs, and one day to gain financial independence and join the middle class, which many did. So that's what it looked like in the beginning. Life was good. Americans were free and they prospered. They didn't pay an income tax. Business didn't pay an income tax either. Government was funded mostly by import taxes, and their power matched those granted in the Constitution. The government also had limited wealth. People were able to rise from poverty to financial independence in the middle class. And migrants came to our country to work hard to become citizens and work their way to the middle class to become free Americans. Now, during this period, there were some wars to fight, but almost all of them were in North America that helped expand America and keep it safe. Wars that actually benefited Americans. That's a novel concept. You can contrast that to our military of today that hasn't fought a war on our soil or for our benefit for over 100 years. But things began to take a turn for the worse in Phase 2. Even though European theater wars were a fixture on that continent for the last 1,000 years, a new war almost a half a world away with likely no bearing on America, regardless of the outcome, became the pretense to begin the failure of our country. Phase 2, the start of the decline, begins in 1913 for two reasons. First, as I mentioned already, this was the first real personal income tax and corporate tax began. This allows the government to begin to mandate that Americans not only fund a war on another continent, but that they also sacrifice their children to this effort to ensure that the government and their friends enrich themselves using our money in our families' lives. All under the deception that this is what patriotism is. Of course, this isn't patriotism, but it starts a new trend that will be repeated without end to this day. Not like the short-lived income tax forced on Americans to help pay for the slaughter of other Americans during the Civil War. This tax was here to stay this time. Now, the second reason we start Phase 2 in 1913 was that this was a year also marked the creation of the Federal Reserve Bank. This trendy new name gave Americans the illusion that the Federal Reserve was a government entity whose interest was to serve America. And countless Americans, they still believe, even today, this is a government organization. It isn't, though. It's a group of for-profit banks that control the direction of our economy for the benefit of their profit, not yours. And what's the easiest way for banks to make money? Collect interest off of loans. That's how. And in this case, loans made to the federal government. The creation of this combination allows the government, through taxes, to take as much of your money as they see fit, along with a small group of private banks that are permitted to bet for or against your financial future and that of our country, and then control the rules of the game to ensure that their bet pays off. It starts us on a slippery slope of failure that continues to this day. So in Phase 2, the start of the decline, America starts to change for the worse. Let's take a look at how things start to change. For free independent Americans, as I mentioned already, they have to start to take money that they worked for away from their family and give it to the government due to the new income tax. See the new yellow arrow highlighted in red showing your money transferring to the government. The government used your money to fund World War I at first, but once the government figured out how to skim Americans' money for themselves, to invest it in wars for their own profit, we quickly progressed from World War I to World War II, to the Korean War, to Vietnam, just to name a few. Spending your money and sacrificing your children on foreign adventures that enrich them at our expense is the norm in our country now. But financing endless for-profit wars was just the beginning. With the money they can take from your family now, they begin an endless stream of constitutional violations by seizing federal control of rights and authorities clearly not permitted in our Constitution. Take a look at how the income tax burden shifts for supporting the government during Phase 2. When Phase 1 ended in 1913, shown by the red arrow, the people still funded 0% of the government revenue through personal income taxes. But by 1960, the people now pay over half of all the taxes the federal government collects. Take a good look at how once the income tax came into play, the government takes more and more and more of your money every year. It's amazing. And as a result of transferring your wealth to the government, notice that the wealth of the people begins to get smaller, as highlighted in red. But how did this affect the government and their friends? Since Americans are transferring their hard work and wealth to the government and their friends, and the government's keeping some of it for themselves and using some of it to fund wars for their own profit, the wealth and power of the government begins to increase. Notice how during phase 2, the government and friends money pile in the red box, it's getting larger, while the people's, yours, got smaller. But it's also getting larger for another reason, debt. In just the 47 years in phase 2, the government manages to spend so much money that even after fleecing Americans with the new income tax, they still spend so much that they increase the national debt by almost 4,000%, from $47 billion to over $1.7 trillion. Take a look at this graph. And these are inflation-adjusted 2012 dollars. So don't be tricked that this is due to inflation. It isn't. It's due to reckless spending and thievery. Now think about it. For the first 137 years, we incurred $47 billion of debt. Still too much. But in the next 47 years, it went up to $1,700 billion. And this is also in spite of the fact that at the same time in 1913, the government imposed the first corporate income tax. As you can see, there's a larger revenue stream going from business to the government than in phase 1. But this new business income tax hasn't stopped big business from gaining more wealth and power during this period. Because unlike the new American taxpayer, who pays more and more and more of the government funding as each year goes by, business with concentrated power and wealth, they figured out how to, shall we say, influence Congress to hold the line on their tax increases. Take a look here how corporate income taxes held steady in phase 2. The power of the business lobby at work. But even though the American people employed all 535 members in Congress to represent them, they obviously didn't represent them or lobby on the behalf of regular Americans. Instead, they sold out regular Americans who have to pay more every year. Now this slide's a little bit busy, but just to show how treacherous this is. Business taxes shown in yellow, they hold steady. Tariffs shown in purple are actually going down. But Americans, the blue line, they keep paying more and more. It goes up every year. And now what about Americans in need? Using compassion and help as their calling card, the government begins a small transfer, well, kind of small, of middle-class wealth to Americans in need. See the new arrow in the red circle? This government transfer, way beyond any authority that the federal government is entitled to, begins the process of the government replacing the church, friends, and family as the provider of help for those in need. Now overall, the crack in the foundation of our country isn't big enough for many to notice. And the process is still working enough because opportunity and jobs are still being created in our country, as shown by the highlighted green circle. And people in need, they continue to work themselves out of poverty to join the middle class. Not much changes for immigration. Immigrants, they continue to come to America. They continue to integrate into our culture with the goal of working their way to the independent middle class. But you can see how immigrants keep working their way to the middle class here in the blue circle. And this is how phase 2 ends. On the surface, things look pretty good. But if I would have told you in 1913 that Americans who paid no income taxes would be funding over 50% of the government just 47 years later, you would have told me I was crazy. If I would have told you in 1913 that for the next 47 years that we would sacrifice the lives of over 1 million of our sons on foreign wars with little to no benefit to America by 1960 and spend billions of dollars on these wars, you would have said no way, not possible. If I would have told you that the government would take 10% of the taxes that you do pay and give this money to other Americans as they see fit in some form of welfare, you would have said impossible. This is America, not a communist country. But it happened. If I would have told you that even with the government now taking huge sums of cash off the American people and businesses through these new taxes, that debt wouldn't go down, but that it would go up almost 4,000%, close to $2 trillion, you may have wanted to commit me. But it did happen. So as phase 2 ends, the American citizens now the primary source of funding for the government. Government and friends are beginning to consolidate power and wealth. Big business has figured out how to minimize income tax damage. And endless wars, even though none of them related to Americans or our country, is the new norm. But in spite of all this, Americans are still working their way out of poverty, joining the middle class. The middle class is doing fine, despite the fact that the foundations that our country are built upon are beginning to crack. So as we march along, there appears to be a destination that we are headed off to far off in the distance. But it's hard to tell exactly what it is. It almost looks like a cemetery to me. It kind of looks like this, but it's too hard to tell. I'm not sure though, but I do mention it to the group that I think we should stop. Let's make sure we're going the right way. But the government and the media, they hear what I'm saying. And with their loud bullhorns, they quickly drown out my voice. They convince everyone else I'm wrong. That isn't a cemetery at all, they say. Rather, they tell us, it's the American way to keep marching on. Because we're actually marching off to paradise. Utopia, they say. The odd thing to me is that nobody else seems too concerned. It looks like something's going wrong here. But life is still pretty good. Maybe I'm misreading the signs. So we all march on. But by the time we get very far into phase 3, full speed ahead to failure, there are several new ominous changes that are much too obvious to ignore anymore. And it starts to become more evident that something has gone wrong. So when we meet the next time, we'll find out what are these new detrimental changes that take place that can't be ignored anymore. We'll find out if you noticed them also. Because when we get to phase 3, a lot of us lived through some or all of these times. America was doing its best to hold its own during the first 2 phases. But by the time we get to phase 3, it becomes apparent we aren't doing as well as we thought we were. Are we really headed to a graveyard? We'll find out next time.